In July 1959, a single-family house from Long Island was sliced down the middle, shipped to Moscow, and rebuilt inside a park so that Soviet crowds could file past the open cross-section and look straight in the way you look inside of a doll's house. Macy's furnished it, and General Electric supplied the kitchen, painted a very confident yellow. The house had been sent to do one job, and it was not diplomacy. The model came from Stanley Klein, an architect who had drawn it for a Long Island developer named Herbert Sadkin, copied from an actual street in Comic, New York. To ready it for Moscow, Sadkin handed the plans to Raymond Loewy's design office, where a young architect named Andrew Geller cut the house lengthwise. Macy's loaded it with a sofa bed, a television, and a self-propelled vacuum. Every choice answered to one specification. Klein wanted the house kept simple enough that it would not seem out of reach, and the organizers picked a kitchen a notch above average on the theory that one of the fanciest ones would be too easy to wave away as something almost no American really owned. It had to be a kitchen that a Soviet correspondent would be forced to concede an ordinary factory worker could buy. That kitchen is where Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev ended up, jabbing fingers at each other over a dishwasher, while a younger man named Leonid Brezhnev hovered nearby trying to block the American press agent from getting clean photographs. The cameras rolled in color for rebroadcast in both countries. Nixon's argument for his civilization that afternoon rested on none of the usual material. No missile count, no election result. Just the building. A washing machine bolted to the floor, a dishwasher, a patch of grass, and the claim that anyone back home could have one. The exhibition was billed as a cultural exchange. It worked more like a weapons demonstration, and the ordinance was the deed. I'm Sam, and in this video, I want to show you how this suburban house was purpose-built, aimed, and deployed by governments on every continent as a tool of political control. The blueprint, ironically enough, was sketched by the movement it was built to defeat, and several of the governments that wielded it most aggressively said so on the record. 5 years before Moscow, on a Long Island potato field, William Levitt was building houses the way Ford built cars and telling anyone who would listen that this made him the General Motors of construction. He earned that title. Trucks dropped materials at sites spaced 60 feet apart. Crews moved down the line in sequence, each man reduced to a single motion. One team for white paint, another for red, one worker whose entire job all day was to bolt washing machines to floors. To keep costs low, the Levitts bought their own forests in Oregon, milled their own lumber, and made their own nails. The houses came off the line at $7,990, about $100,000 today. 750 square feet on a seventh of an acre, 2 bedrooms and an unfinished upstairs, and to a young family climbing out of a city walk-up, they felt enormous. The federal government underwrote the mortgages, and in return, it shaped the product. The FHA's recommended floor plan set the kitchen at the back so a mother could watch children in the yard, and put a lawn and 4 fruit trees out front for the father to tend. The 5 Levittown models differed only in color and in the arrangement of the windows. The sameness was not an accident of cheapness, it was the intent of the design. The state had a very specific picture of the household it wanted to manufacture. Levitt understood he was selling something larger than shelter, and he said so in a sentence that has outlived many of the houses he built. No man who owns his own house and lot can be a communist. He has too much to do, Levitt added, and he meant the too much to do part literally. A man on his knees in the crabgrass on a Saturday, halfway through a mortgage, with a washing machine to keep level and a calendar full of small obligations, is a man whose risk tolerance has been quietly adjusted. The yard alone is a part-time job. The fruit trees need pruning. The roof leaks. The mortgage payment falls on the first. None of those obligations are political on their face. That is the trick. The state did not need its citizens to love it. It needed them to be busy, leveraged, and afraid of losing something specific. A worker carrying 20 years of payments is not at the union hall on Saturday morning and not on a picket line on Monday, because the picket line is now competing for his time against the lawn and against the bank. The most awkward part of the story is who filed the original design. In 1872, Friedrich Engels, co-author of the Communist Manifesto, published a long argument called the housing question. He was answering reformers of his own day, specifically the Austrian economist Emil Sachs, who proposed handing workers their own little houses and gardens. Sachs thought this would turn workers into small capitalists and improve their morals. Engels thought it was a trap, and he described why. A city worker's freedom to pick up and leave, Engels argued, was his only real leverage against the boss. Chain them once again to the soil, he wrote of the plan to give workers homes, and you break their power of resistance to wage cutting. The mortgage was the chain. A man who can walk can bargain. A man who owes 20 years of payment on a house in one town will take the wage he is offered. Engels was not even the first to notice the link. A decade earlier, in the 1860s, the French sociologist Frédéric Laplace had reached it from the other side. A conservative who studied working-class family budgets across Europe, he concluded that owning property anchored a family and steadied it against radicalism, and he urged it for exactly that reason. So the diagnosis came from both ends at once. Engels saw a trap and warned the workers away from it. Laplace saw a remedy and pressed it on the state. The Cold War West took Laplace's prescription, the one Engels had marked as a snare. Giving a man something to lose is the obvious half. The deeper half is what the house quietly replaced. A house with the mortgage paid off is a pension. In old age, it deletes the largest recurring cost a person faces, which means the owner has pre-funded his own retirement and his own insurance against hardship. While he is paying the mortgage, every additional tax dollar competes with the most important payment in his life, so he resists the taxes that fund collective provision. Once the house is his outright, his security sits in a private asset and he stops needing the collective. The sociologist Jim Kameny noticed this consequence across whole countries around 1980. The political scientist Francis Castles later sharpened it into a claim he called the really big trade-off. Lay the nations out and a fork appears. Countries that drove ownership highest, the United States, Australia, Canada, built thin welfare states with low taxes and meager public pensions. Countries that kept ownership low, Sweden, the Netherlands, West Germany, built thick ones. West Germany is the cleanest case. It leaned on social housing, declined to push every family into a deed, and to this day holds one of the lowest ownership rates in the wealthy world. The house is a small private welfare state, and the man who owns one decides he needs less of the public kind. American leaders dress the weapon as a dream and let citizens feel their loyalty as ordinary self-interest. Other governments, facing the left at closer range, put their reasoning into the record. Singapore said it most plainly. When Lee Kuan Yew took power in 1959, he faced a genuine pro-communist movement, street riots, and an opposition movement that drew real crowds. His government built the high-rise flats of the Housing and Development Board and sold them to citizens. In his memoirs, he explained the reasoning without any decoration. He had watched renters in capital cities reliably vote against whoever governed, and he wanted owners instead. His sharper motive concerned the draft. A young man sent to do national service whose family owned nothing would conclude he was, quote, fighting to protect the properties of the wealthy, end quote. Give his mother a flat and that calculation changes. You can watch that system arrive in a single life. In 1972, a mother of two named Hyop Chong Lei left the off-top house she had been sharing with another family and moved into a housing board flat on the 10th floor. She was terrified of the elevator the first time she stepped into it, unsure what would happen when the doors closed. She rode it every day and grew to love the height. It was breezy being that high up, she said. Her flat was a rental, the bottom rung of a system designed to carry families like hers into ownership, turning the relief of a roof into a stake in the order that had issued it. Britain said it through arithmetic. On August 11, 1980, Margaret Thatcher came for tea at 39 Amersham Road in Harold Hill and handed James and Maureen Patterson the deeds to the council house they had rented since 1962. They bought it for £8,315. The phrase behind the policy, a property-owning democracy, had been coined in the 1920s by a Scottish Unionist MP named Noel Skelton, who feared a newly enfranchised electorate dangerously open to, quote, the socialist disguise as an educator, end quote. Michael Heseltine, the minister who carried the bill, called it one of the most important social revolutions of the century. Right to buy is also where the simplest version of the cause and effect objection runs into trouble. The honest skeptic's point is selection. People who already lean conservative are likelier to buy houses in the first place, so of course owners pull right. But council housing in 1980 was the most reliably labor voting tenure in the country, and the discounts ran steep enough to pull in households that would have never otherwise bought. The Ds went by the million to people who started out on the left. Buyers did choose. What they were choosing, though, was an offer the state had engineered to be nearly irresistible, and the rightward drift among those who took it showed up regardless. This was labor's own base being converted into owners at a scale no ordinary market would produce. Then interest rates climbed. The Pattersons' marriage broke under the strain of the payments. Maureen tried to hold the house alone, could not, and moved into a mobile home. "If I'd foreseen the end of my marriage, I'd never have bought," she said in 2002. The house she had been handed later sold for £180,000, more than 20 times what she and James paid. Italy is the case where the stakes were highest, and the language barrier means this one is probably new to you. After the war, Italy held, by far, the largest communist party in the West. Before the 1948 election, a communist-led victory looked plausible enough that the United States, the CIA, and the Vatican poured money, aid, and pressure into preventing it. The Christian Democrats won decisively in the end, but the fear had been real, and the question of how to keep the Italian working class inside the Western order, rather than lose it to the party, turned very urgent and literally concrete. The answer carried a name. Amintore Fanfani, a Christian Democratic economist serving as labor minister, pushed through Law 43 of 1949, titled in the plain language of its aim, Measures to Increase Worker Employment by Aiding the Construction of Houses for Laborers. Workers, employers, and the state each paid in. The worker's share came out of his wage packet as a small monthly deduction that the government sold at the cost of, quote, the equivalent of 1 cigarette a day. Over 14 years, the program built roughly 355,000 dwellings at around 2 million rooms in more than 5,000 Italian towns. In the Christian democratic worldview, the family home was the base cell of society, the standing answer to communist collectivism, and the plan existed to manufacture millions of those cells. The newsreels of 1949 that announced the housing program also announced, over the protests of the left, Italy's entry into NATO. The House and the Atlantic Alliance arrived bundled as a single decision about which side the country would belong to. Every government so far has deployed the House to keep the left at bay. But consider what happens when the weapon turns on its operator. In Zhengzhou, on the north bank of the Yellow River, a man with the last name Lin put 200,000 yuan down on an apartment in the summer of 2020 and waited for a building that was never built. It was to be his first home. The developer was Evergrande, the largest in the country, and the flat had been sold the way most Chinese flats were sold, off a plan and paid for in advance, with a mortgage of around 3,300 yuan a month coming due while the tower stood unbuilt behind a construction fence. By the summer of 2022, he had joined thousands of buyers across the country who simply stopped paying the banks for homes that would never be finished. To see why a communist state had staked its economy on families like this, go back to 1998. Beijing ended the old work unit system of allocated housing and let urban Chinese buy their units. Ownership climbed to around 9 in 10 households, among the highest rates anywhere. Property swelled into roughly 6/10 of household wealth and about a quarter of the economy. Inside a single generation, the party that took power denouncing private property had handed hundreds of millions of citizens the one possession the West had always prescribed as the cure for revolution. Lee Kuan Yew's reasoning, carried out by the heirs of Mao. China's project is a political experiment on a scale that dwarfs the British one. When Beijing ended allocated housing, it let sitting tenants buy their work unit flats at heavily subsidized prices, and a population never sorted for any attachment to private property became, almost overnight, a nation of owners. They bought, yes, but they bought because the state had just made owning the only road on offer and priced it to move. Whatever ownership does to the people who take it on had about as clean a run here as history has offered, and the dependency Engels predicted formed anyway. Then the asset began to act like a threat. Prices in the big cities pulled away from wages. The young were shut out. Capital that might have built factories went into flipping condos. At the 2017 Party Congress, Xi Jinping gave the correction its slogan: "Houses are for living in, not for speculation." It drew a 15-second ovation. In August 2020, the state imposed 3 caps on developer borrowing, ceilings on debt measured against assets, against equity, and against cash. Everran breached all 3, lost access to due credit, and fell apart, carrying liabilities near 2.5 trillion yuan, with the money for several 100,000 homes it had sold and never built still on the books. The state that created the weapon found it could not safely set it down without major consequences. Japan took a different exit. A wooden house there is treated by the tax code the same way a car is, a thing that wears out. Its assessed value reaches 0 at 22 years. On average, the house is demolished and rebuilt after roughly 30 years, compared with 55 in the United States and 77 in Britain. Strip the appreciating structure out, and the engine the Anglo model runs on disappears. The house cannot become the private pension because the building is worth nothing by the time the loan is paid. By the 2023 survey, Japan counted 9 million empty homes, 1 in every 7 dwellings, double the figure 30 years prior. More than 3/4 had come through inheritance, from elderly owners dying or entering care, their houses passing to heirs who did not want them. What the West aimed like a weapon, Japan let ripen into its natural endpoint. A box quietly rotting on a plot waiting for the demolition crew. The weapon worked so completely that it vanished from view. Now, owners do not experience their politics as the output of a program. They experience it as caring about their street and their savings, which is precisely what success looks like for a device built to install loyalty while feeling like nothing in particular. Sort voters by housing tenure across the whole age range and at every income level from poorest to richest, and owners sit substantially further to the right than renters. The gap holds after you account for age and income, and in Britain and China, where the state pushed ownership onto populations that began well to the left, the rightward shift still followed. The house is doing some of the work the way Engels named and Kameny formalized. But now, almost globally it seems, the supply of affordable houses in areas with actual opportunity relative to median wages has run dry. A generation that in 1960 would have been handed the inoculating asset now rents into its 30s and 40s, holding nothing that doubles as a pension, carrying no private safety net. So, moving in the opposite direction, it now wants a public one. The revival of redistributive politics among renters under 40 is the predicted output of a machine denied its inputs. Incumbent owners, meanwhile, profit when nothing gets built because scarcity lifts what they already hold. It is no surprise that ownership is one of the strongest predictors of opposition to new construction. The people who inherited the stabilizer have begun hoarding the ammunition for their own balance sheets. Every house that does not get built is one more young renter the old apparatus will never reach. The housing on your street was issued. It came with a floor plan that put the mother at the back window and the father under the fruit trees, and it came with politics. The lawn and the equity were real. They were the package. But a package can only arrive when someone is willing to deliver it, and the people who control the warehouse have started to prefer to keep the doors welded shut. If this changed the way you see the house on your street, subscribe. If you like the thinking, watch my other videos and join my newsletter, link in the description. I'll see you in the next one.